Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
And we're here to continue our talk about Japanese mythology. Yep, this is going to be a great one. It's one of my favorite myths I get to do today.
Awesome.
Yep, you'll hear the story of Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, the most famous goddess from Japanese history, and the story of why the most famous sword in Japanese history is basically called lawnmower.
Really?
Yeah, it's a long story.
All right, let's
Yep.
have it.
So like a lot of the stories, it starts way back at the dawn of time. Now, when we last left the gods or kami of Japan, remember Izanagi had like dumped his sister / wife in the land of the dead and had gone back to the world of the living.
Right.
Now, in those days, you could apparently make gods just at the drop of a hat. Even though his sister died trying to give birth to fire, it turns out he didn't actually have to go that far to make gods, because after leaving the land of the dead, he had to ritually purify himself. So he bathed himself in a waterfall, and the drops of water that fell off his body became more gods.
Oh,
So it turns out he didn't really need her after all. He could just make more gods of his own,
okay.
which he proceeded to do. A bunch of them were made, most of whom aren't important. The most famous one was Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun. There's also Tsukinomi, who is the god / goddess of the moon. Those two do not get along, by the way.
Oh.
They haven't spoken in thousands of years. That's why you never see the sun and the moon out at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah. And their annoying brother, Susanoo, who's the god of storms and wind and things like that.
I was gonna guess wind.
Yeah, he was a big windbag. Amaterasu represents the sun, and in a way she represents all of Japan. She is the mother goddess, even though she was not the first god or the most powerful one, in a way she symbolizes all of Japan. In fact, the Japanese flag is a red circle against a white background, which represents the sun.
Does it actually?
Yeah,
Cool, okay.
yep. It's land of the rising sun, and that's Amaterasu. But her life hasn't been easy. So all the gods are living in the land of the gods, and Susanoo was causing trouble as usual. He's acting up. He's doing all kinds of horrible things, defecating in sacred temples and things like that. Like there was just no end to his antics, and so the gods threw him out.
This is the moon?
No, this is Susanoo, the god of storms.
Storms, okay.
Yep. So they threw him out. So he wandered the earth, and he figures now, I know he'll take me in, Amaterasu. She's loving, she's compassionate, she's the sun. I'm sure she won't throw me out. So he goes and moves in with her for a while. They do not get along, not surprisingly. So one day they decide to have fun by having a god-making contest. Well, they'll both create, new gods. Again, you could do it in those days. So they did. Unfortunately, they had somewhat ill-defined rules as to winning and losing this contest. So they created a bunch of gods who all have names and personalities and so forth that I won't get into here. And in the end, when they were done, Susanoo had created more gods, but Amaterasu had created more powerful beings and more interesting gods. And so she believed that she had won, but Susanoo believed that he had won. So huge fight. The god of storms, the goddess of the sun. She throws him out. He retaliates by killing one of her horses, stripping the skin off of it, and throwing the flayed body through the walls of her castle into her sewing room and killing one of her servants. Yeah. So Amaterasu loses it completely. She has a complete breakdown. She gives up on everything. It turns her back on the earth, and she goes and lives in a cave and vows never to come out again. Now, this is problematic.
And there's the horse.
Yep, there's the horse. That's a version that's safe for kids to read, so they've made a few amendments to it.
He still has his skin.
Okay, he still has his skin in that one. See, right away. I found one version that said it was a flaming horse. He could kill the horse and set it on fire. Other ones translate that word as flayed. So, all right, she goes into a cave, and in mythology, we'll encounter several different times that the sun goes away. And this is one of the most famous versions of that story. So without Amaterasu, it's dark all the time. Plants can't grow. Human
Yeah.
beings are starving. And she also, because she's a goddess of goodness, she keeps away monsters. And so the Yomi is opening up, and monsters from the netherworld are rising to the surface again. So there's a whole hue and cry to the gods to save us and so forth. So the gods realize they have to do something. So they try to coax her out of the cave. She refuses to come. They try to come up with clever plans to lure her out. The first plan was to put a bunch of roosters outside of her cave. And when the rooster started crowing, everyone knows a rooster crowing brings out the sun. So they thought that would lure her out of the cave. A clever ploy that she did not fall for.
They were missing the cornflakes.
Yeah, so she's still in the cave, and nothing they can do. So they gnash their teeth trying to figure out how to come up with a plan. And eventually they all turn to Ami no Izumi. Now, Ami no Izumi knows exactly what to do. She's the goddess of partying and good times. Yeah. And so she gets all the gods together. They brew up a lot of sake, the really powerful Japanese rice wine. Sake figures in many Japanese myths. So Ami no Izumi turns over a vat for brewing sake and starts dancing on top of it, and she takes off her clothes. She was the kind of goddess you didn't have to suggest that to twice. So she did a nude dance, which got all the gods very excited, and they started making a whole lot of noise. And they were having a great time, and Amaterasu just had to stick her head up to see what was going on. And then she saw Ami no Izumi dancing and come out to join the party. And when she did, of course, the other gods rolled a big boulder over the mouth of the cave. She couldn't go back into it again because this is olden times, which there's only one cave in all of Japan, apparently. So they sealed it up with a huge rock. So she was out of the cave, and she went back in heaven and made the sun rise. Everybody could live again. So everybody was really happy. In some versions of the story, instead of the new dancing that lures her out, they put a mirror in front of the cave, and then they make a lot of noise as she sticks her head out, and she sees her own reflection in the mirror, not recognizing it, and believes they've replaced her with a new sun goddess, which makes her jealous, and she comes out, and then they seal the cave behind her. I don't like that version of the story because it makes the most powerful goddess in Japan, no smarter than my cat, that she couldn't recognize her own reflection in a mirror. So we'll go with the first version. The first version I heard was the dancing bit.
Well, here it says she'd never seen her reflection.
Yeah,
Which lends a little more credit.
They try to give credit to it, but still, it's like Wikipedia does list Amaterasu in their list of LGBTQ goddesses, so for what it's worth. So she was back in heaven, everything was fine, but everything was not fine with Susanoo, because he was still at odds with his sister.
Mm-hmm.
Now that he had upset Amaterasu, literally no one liked him. The last person who could have stood up for him, he had now ticked off. So he is wandering the earth, trying to find, the meaning of life. And eventually he runs into a family, a husband and wife and their daughter, and they are crying. They are very upset. Why are you upset? Well, it turns out they have one daughter, and they used to have 9.
Oh.
They had 8 daughters that were killed. It turns out there's a monster called Orochi. Now, Orochi is a 9-headed dragon. It's sometimes described as a 9-headed snake. We'll go with dragon because they're cooler.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
So
on board.
they've been eating up all of their daughters, and they only have one left.
Like
and
all in one shot? 'Cause
one at
there's
a
9
time.
heads?
He would come back and eat one daughter each time he attacked. So they pretty much know what's going to happen next to their last daughter, and they're very upset.
So they don't. They just wait for it. They don't.
Well, you can
leave?
try fighting back, but
Escape?
Orochi is extremely powerful.
They didn't run.
Apparently not. He's fast. But fortunately, there's a wandering god
Oh. Okay.
who wants to prove himself. So he offers to kill Orochi in return for their last remaining daughter.
Okay.
Now, he is a jerk. But on the other hand, they try, okay, honey, we know he's not like the best god in heaven. However, it is better than being eaten alive. And probably being married to Susanoo was better than being eaten alive. So the deal is struck. He'll kill Orochi in return for their daughter. And the first thing he does is change her into a comb and stick her in his long hair. Why he does this, I don't know. It was just a Susanoo thing to do. So he comes up with a clever plan, which is unusual for him. Susanoo winds up brewing up some magic sake, incredibly potent stuff. He also arranges for a big fence to be built with a door in the fence for each one of Orochi's heads. And he sticks a vat of sake in front of each of them. So they sticks his heads through one at a time, and each head drinks the sake and gets roaring drunk and eventually passes out.
Okay.
And while he's sleeping, of course, Susanoo grabs his sword and starts hacking him to pieces.
Well, now I want to, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So he's cutting up the monster, and his sword hits something really hard. So hard, in fact, that his sword snaps, even though it's a magic sword forged in heaven.
Oh.
It breaks. So he reaches into the monster's guts, and what does he pull out but another sword? A sword even better than the one that he had. It is Ami no Moroko no Tsugi.
The lawnmower?
No. Ami no Moroku no Tsugi means heavenly sword of gathering clouds.
Okay.
It's a spiritual sword. It's symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
So he pulls out heavenly sword of gathering clouds. And he thinks, this is great. This is a magnificent sword. So he runs back and he gives it to Amaterasu. So sorry that I killed your horse and knocked down your wall and murdered a servant, but look, I have this cool sword. And she had to admit it was the finest sword she had ever seen. It was a straight sword, not a katana, despite being depicted in anime several times as a katana. Katanas hadn't been invented yet. This is 1,000 years before the swordsmiths had learned to curve their blades. So she's very happy with this. So she forgives him, and all is right in heaven again. Now, one of the reasons why Amaterasu is revered so strongly in Japan is that she is the progenitor of the entire royal family of Japan. To this day, everyone who's royalty in Japan can trace their lineage back to Amaterasu. True story. So she heard. So
how is this accomplished?
well, she has kids, and her grandson is being sent into Japan to bring peace to a troubled country which is full of war, violence everywhere. So she wants him to make Japan a better place, and so she anoints him essentially as the first emperor.
You did say truce.
Well, yes. If you ask anyone in Japan, it is.
Okay.
So
it is. So it's widely believed. That
yeah,
the
it is
first
widely believed
emperor
that it's
of
true.
Japan-
Yes,
of
the
Japan.
emperor is literally divine. The blood of Amaterasu runs through his veins. So she gives her grandson the sword, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds, and she also gives him a mirror and a jewel. And these would go on to become the royal regalia of Japan that are presented to the emperor when he's crowned, through time immemorial, all the way to the present day.
I had no idea.
Yep, they still exist.
Wow.
Although, to be honest, no one's seen the sword in a long time. We'll get into that. So the grandson is given the royal regalia, which anoints him as the first emperor of Japan. He's sent down to take over the country, which he does. A mirror, a jewel, and a sword figures in a lot of Japanese stories. Those are also some of the key weapons of Sailor Moon. So he restores peace to Japan, but not entirely, because it's always been a group of warring kingdoms. So his grandson is still in the process of trying to bring peace to the land.
Mm-hmm.
His grandson is named Yamato Takura.
Mm-hmm.
Yamato also being a very powerful name in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
He was set out to pacify the rest of the country and bring peace to the land, but things didn't go all that well. Now, he had a deal with someone who was supposed to be his ally who betrayed him. Yes.
What was the name of the sword that you said that it's passed down among the emperors?
Ami no Murakamo no Tsumi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds.
Okay.
Right?
Shouldn't it be in here?
It's in here somewhere, I guarantee it.
Okay.
You could also try royal regalia
Ah.
or just regalia. Anyway, so Yamato is betrayed. He's in the middle of a field, and his arch enemy sets fire to the grass that surrounds him. And so the fire surrounds him in a circle, so he can't get out. He's going to be burned alive. So he pulls out the sword to make a fire break to cut down the grass in front of him. Good plan. But he discovers, of course, it is a magic sword. And as he swings it back and forth, it generates a mighty wind. And so he winds up not only cutting a fire break, but he drives back the flames towards the guy who betrayed him. And his enemy is killed, and he survives. So he's very excited about that, needless to say. And so he renames the sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi, which translates as grass cutter or lawnmower in English.
Okay, for one thing, I'm very impressed with your pronunciation.
Thank you. I've been studying, I took a class in Japanese, I've been listening to anime and watching Japanese movies for a long time.
Clearly.
Yeah, this all is a really important part of Japanese mythology. So the sword is called grass cutter. It is the sword of the Emperor of Japan. Several years later, when one of the emperors was forced to flee, apparently he lost the sword overboard. The rest of the regalia was saved, but they lost the sword. It was recovered years later, but there's a sneaking suspicion the Japanese government actually created a forgery, and it's not the original grass cutter. Because the grass cutter now resides in a temple where no one is allowed to see it. And they made a copy that they admit is a copy, which is actually shown in public, and that's the real one that's presented to the emperor. So we know what it should look like, because the exact copy of it is presented to the emperor when he's crowned. But no one's seen the real one in a couple hundred years.
Okay.
So yes, grass cutter is the most famous sword in Japan. It is their version of like Excalibur. It figures very prominently in anime and manga. Because it was missing for hundreds of years, it has the ability to crop up anytime a hero needs it.
You said it's the equivalent of the Excalibur.
Yeah.
Are there other cultural stories that are parallel to that?
Not exactly.
In the same way that many cultures have like a flood story?
The idea of the hero with the sword is an important part of a lot of cultures. The fact that grass cutter has such a lengthy history is kind of unique to Japan.
Okay.
But
because
Excalibur is the sword of England granted to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake, Nimue. And drawing the sword from the stone conferred on him the right to be king of England. Or she just gave him the sword, he didn't have to draw it from the stone, depending on which version you want to go with.
So would you consider that an equal lengthy history to...
It is equal. There's other famous swords. Durandal was the sword of Charlemagne, which was again a gift from God, in this case a Christian God. In one version of the story, Durandal actually had one of the nails that nailed Christ to the cross was melted into it when the sword was being forged. So history is rife with that kind of thing. Since it was missing for a long time, grass cutter pops up in a lot of different places. It played a major role in Naruto. And more importantly, or rather more interestingly, in Usagi Yojimbo.
Okay.
Yes, it appears in two of the key Usagi Yojimbo stories.
Is that Hippo?
Yeah, lots of rhino actually. He's
Rhino?
missing his horn. His horn was cut off in a brutal sword fight.
Oh.
That is Usagi Yojimbo, who is the rabbit who's wielding grass cutter in this one.
Okay.
And that's Tomoe, who is a cat girl, and she is a samurai who serves Lord Noyuki. And that is Gen, the rhino. Gen is a bounty hunter who doesn't believe in Bushido. When our hero Usagi stumbles across a sword, a fabulous sword, he doesn't recognize it at first. But as long as he carries the sword, everybody wants him dead. And so he joins forces with Lady Tomoe and Gen to try to make sense of it all. It's a great story. I highly recommend Stan Sakai's Usagi Yojimbo. And humorously, I didn't read this until today, I didn't reread this until today because I knew we were going to discuss it. So I went back to this book again. I read it originally 20 years ago. He retells the story I just told you in comic book form in a really terrific way, far superior to that one.
Okay.
That was drawn by Ron Randall, who is a very competent artist. But Stan Sakai, who does Usagi Yojimbo, is a genius. So yes, if you want to know more about Japanese mythology or history, it's a really accurate Japanese history despite having anthropomorphic animals. Read Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai.
Very good.
So, what do you think of that?
I love it all. Super
Yeah.
intriguing.
It's a different way of looking at the world.
Well, that's the funny thing. Different but same in a lot of areas.
Mythology, Joseph Campbell felt that all in this were really one myth,
Yeah.
that there was a monomyth, and that all cultures kind of want the same thing deep down. The Japanese people are very different from American people, but all human beings are alike to a certain extent.
I love it.
Yeah. So it's going to be it for Japan for now. There's a lot more great stories, but I'm going to move on. I know, there's a lot more good stories though. We have a lot more to cover. We'll be leaving Japan and moving on probably to China next week,
Okay.
because they're very close to each other and the two mythologies have influenced each other strongly.
All right.
Any questions?
What is your most anticipated highlight of next week's discussion?
We get to talk about like Asian dragons for one thing,
Okay.
which again are very different from Western dragons. And you can't tell anything about Chinese mythology without doing dragons. I'm probably covering like dragons and the origin story the first week, and then I'll get into one of the greatest stories ever told, was the legend of the Monkey King. It's probably going to be 2 weeks from now.
Okay. Very cool.
All right, so until next time, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe. Thank you.